Let me just explain a couple of things. First, today we are celebrating Maundy Thursday, commemorating the washing of the feet and the institution of the Lord's Supper. But it is unique in that we are in this situation where we are on lockdown and because of a virus that is spreading. So we have to adjust. We will forgo the illustration of the washing of the feet by, we normally do that by actually washing the feet. We also do at the conclusion of Maundy Thursday Mass what we call the stripping of the altar. That's just part of our tradition. We will forgo that today as well. That is not to say we do not commemorate the institution of the Lord's Supper and the message of the washing of the feet. Maundy Thursday. Maundy is not a usual common English word that we say in our modern language, but it is where it is the word that is the root of the word mandate. Because Jesus gave a mandate, a command to the apostles at the Lord's Supper when he told them to love one another. It is our duty and our salvation to obey this command. It is a duty, but it doesn't stay a duty because when we're used to doing it, in the beginning it is a duty and obligation. But that duty becomes more and more joy and less an obligation. It's God's will that we discover His joy, that we enter into the joy of our Master. And the joy of our Master is to love. And to see that love in full in the hearts of those whom He loves. God's will is that we discover that joy, that delight in obeying His commands, just like Jesus demonstrated. The perfect man among us, Jesus Christ. Psalm 40, talking about Jesus the Messiah, said, I delight to do your will. Your law is within my heart. The law was not an obligation. The law was not something that pushes Jesus under duress, but it is something that is in his heart, something that motivates him to do according to the commands. I delight to do your will. It doesn't say I am pressured to do your will, but I delight to do your will. The labor, the work, the labor of doing God's command is not to be labored. The labor is not meant to be labored, but to savor, to taste and see the goodness of the Lord. So we labor out of love to savor the joy of it. We do not labor so that we are belabored, so that we can taste and see the goodness of the law. St. Paul said that the law was a tutor, which is what we need in the beginning until it's second nature to us. It's like a drill sergeant training civilians at first, when they join, training civilians until they are molded into a disciplined army. But we don't like the first days of training. Because the drill sergeant is on us, breathing down our necks and training us. It's discipline at first, and then it becomes second nature to us. It has to be written on stone first before it's written on our hearts. There has to be a getting used to the law and obedience to it first before it becomes a delight to us, before it becomes second nature and part of our DNA. And then the commandments will no longer be burdensome. because it will be, like I said, second nature to us. It's like, use several illustrations, but I used to play the guitar. I've played the guitar for a long time now. I'm not as used to it as I was before. But when you begin, you will most probably develop blisters on your fingertips because you're not used to it. But once you're used to it, you develop corn on the tip of your fingers, and you're used to it, and you're used to the feel of the strings, and they're not tough on you anymore, but you have conquered the pain. Now you start enjoying playing. It's no longer a burden. It's no longer something you have to learn. It's already something you have learned, and that now you use for leisure. Not an obligation, but enjoyment. Now, I also remember when I was learning to drive. I thought driving was the most impossible thing to do in the world because I didn't know how to. I was just learning. And this one cruel driver, who was already a learned driver, saw me and the sign on the car that I was, a student driver. He was intimidating me, and he was, just teasing me. You hit something, you run into something, etc., etc. I thought, how cruel. And then I learned to drive. Now, sometimes it's a joy, except these days, it's a joy because there's nobody else on the road. But sometimes it's not so much a joy when you're on EDSA and the traffic is bad. But it's no longer a burden. It's no longer something that you have to do. It's something that you enjoy doing, and it's part of who you are already. But there's a process of growth which begins with saying yes to the command and dying to self. Loving one another, which is Jesus' command at the Lord's Supper. Loving one another requires the dying to self. The thinking of others first, ahead of us, before us. Thinking of them as greater than ourselves. Hence the washing of the feet. In those times, they didn't have enclosed shoes. They wore sandals. And they did not have paved streets. They walked on dirt roads. And on those dirt roads were different kinds of disgusting things, including droppings of, camels, horses, lamb, sheep, goats, etc. And their feet really got dirty. A servant washes the feet of guests. So, to wash another person's feet means you acknowledge that you're lower than they are. Jesus demonstrated and gave an example of being humble and dying to ourselves and our egos and our pride and washing each other's feet. The feet represented the worst, the dirtiest, the stinkiest, the most repulsive, the most revolting side of another person, our brother. And the washing of their feet requires us to swallow our pride, to die to ourselves, to do it to our own hurt, to our own inconvenience, even if it's nauseating, even if it's disgusting. We deliver our brother from his worst, from his dirtiest, from his most repulsive and revolting side. Jesus showed that example. And he showed that example knowing that these very disciples that whose feet he was going to wash and whom he was going to give communion to, he knew that they were going to betray him, they were going to deny him, they were going to abandon him. I know that it is, in some traditions, it is a requirement that before we receive communion, we are to be in what they call a state of grace. But these disciples, these apostles, were, it's doubtful that they were in a state of grace because they were planning to do something and they were not strong enough to stand with Jesus. But Jesus ignored them and he loved them to the end, loved them to the uttermost, and gave them communion, accepted them as they were. It's, I'm not starting a controversy, but I'm just trying to show the scandalously amazing love that God has for us as shown by Jesus. God's mercy and God's forgiveness are not dependent on how good we are. Let me say that again. God's mercy and God's forgiveness are not dependent on how good or holy we are. It's not dependent on our apology, but on his love, his initiative to love. John said he loved them to the end. It means he loved them to the uttermost. It means he loved them eternally. Hear Jesus singing to us, I'll be loving you eternally. Because he commands, before he gives that command to love, for us to love one another, he shows it first. He only commands what he does. And we confess our sins because we fail many times and we don't obey this command. We confess in order for us to return to God's love. Confession is not so that God will forgive us, because he already has forgiven us. Confession is returning to his love. That's why it's called the sacrament of reconciliation, not the sacrament of confession. Because if we don't reconcile with God when we're not close to him, guess who moved away from the other? We did. God's love is stubborn, it's always there. It's our choice and our decision whether to come back to it or not. Somebody said about the sacrament of reconciliation, all could, some should, none must. All could receive the sacrament. Some indeed should receive it, but none must, or none is required to do so just to obtain God's forgiveness, because it's always there. But we should, and we could, because it's available. Because again, forgiveness is not earned, but it is lived. The reason God forgives us is so that we can live that forgiveness in his mercy and in the fullness of his life. Notice it's one way. God's love is one way. Now, people say love is a two-way street. Well, we'll get to that later. But love really is one way. When you love, you don't expect for a return. That is what true love is. Now, when the recipient received properly your love and understands it, then he has no choice but to also love. Because that's what love does. It begets love. Now it becomes two-way. But in the giving of love, it's one way. Because love does not seek its own. It does not seek for a return. Nobody washed Jesus' feet. The response of the love he gave to his disciples and to all people, the response is desired, not required. God's heart is for us to be like him, whose nature is love. So he asked his disciples, do you understand what I did? Maybe not now, but you will afterward. Later you will understand what I did. Right? I'm not requiring any response at this point, because I'm letting my love bear its fruit in you. Learning and operating in that love is what will make it to weigh, is what will make us respond. Again, Jesus' last will and testament. Before he died, he left this commandment to his disciples. New commandment I give to you, love one another. Don't love like the Gentiles do, who only love their families and their friends. But you should love like children of God, because children of God love their enemies as well. And again, notice also what Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified. Now, I always say this, nobody saw the glory of Jesus in Holy Week. What they saw was defeat. What they saw was Jesus being overcome by principalities and powers. No, the glory and the victory, as we will see on Easter Sunday, the glory of the Lord was in his washing the feet of his disciples, in his suffering for their sake, in his enduring all the torture and the insults and even death that was inflicted on him by unrighteous men. Yet on the cross, he uttered the words, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Jesus said, now you will see the glory of the Son of Man. The glory in his dying for others, in his washing of people's feet, in his humbling himself, in his obeying his Father, even to the point of dying on the cross, a cruel and brutal death. When you love like this, then you prove to be sons of the Father, and you will have the joy of Jesus in full in your hearts and in your lives. We do this before communion. We proclaim the Lord's death, which is his love, until he comes. 1 John 3:16 says, we know love in this, that Jesus gave himself for our sake. Love one another. Jesus' very important last words before he was executed, before he died. That's what we need to do. That's what how we please God. That's the way it is